When innocence hides secrets. For generations, nursery rhymes have been presented as harmless verses meant to soothe children, teach rhythm, and stimulate early language development. Sung at bedtime, whispered in classrooms, or passed from parent to child, these rhymes seem simple, almost naive. Yet, beneath their playful melodies and repetitive structures, many scholars, historians, and cultural researchers argue that something far darker and more complex may be hidden. What if these rhymes were never meant solely for children? What if they encoded political criticism, social trauma, disease, execution, and collective fear, preserved not in history books, but in memory and song? This investigation dives into the symbolic layers of classic nursery rhymes, treating them not as childish nonsense, but as cultural artifacts shaped by oppression, censorship, and survival. Through a journalistic lens, we will examine how historical violence, plague, monarchy, and social inequality may have been disguised as playful poetry, allowing forbidden truths to endure for centuries. Nursery rhymes as historical coded messages. At the heart of this investigation lies a provocative question. Why do so many nursery rhymes contain themes of death, punishment, collapse, and fear? The answer may lie in the political and social climates in which these rhymes were born. Many of the most famous English nursery rhymes originated between the 14th and 18th centuries, periods marked by extreme instability. Europe faced recurring outbreaks of plague, rigid class systems, religious persecution, public executions, and absolute monarchies. Speaking openly against authority could lead to imprisonment, or worse. In such an environment, indirect communication became a survival tool. Historians suggest that nursery rhymes functioned as coded oral journalism. They allowed people to comment on current events, mock rulers, or express collective trauma without openly naming names. When sung as children's songs, these verses could circulate freely, escaping censorship because they appeared meaningless. Take Ba Ba, Black Sheep. On the surface, it is a simple rhyme about wool distribution. But many researchers interpret it as a critique of medieval taxation imposed by the English crown and the church. The 3 bags full allegedly represent how wealth was divided between the monarchy, the clergy, and landowners, leaving peasants with nothing. Similarly, Jack and Jill may not be a tale of clumsiness, but a metaphor for the fall of political figures. Some interpretations link Jack's fall to King Louis XVI of France, whose power collapsed before his execution, while Jill followed shortly after, mirroring Queen Marie Antoinette's fate. These interpretations are not universally accepted, but their persistence across academic debate reveals something crucial. Nursery rhymes are cultural time capsules. They preserve emotional truths even when historical facts are disputed. Another striking example is Humpty Dumpty. Often depicted as an egg, the original rhyme never mentions one. Some historians believe Humpty Dumpty symbolized a powerful cannon used during the English Civil War. Once it fell from the wall, it could not be repaired, representing the irreversible collapse of royal power. From a journalistic perspective, these rhymes resemble anonymous op-eds of their time. They reflect public sentiment, fear, anger, and irony, encoded in metaphor to protect the storyteller. In societies where literacy was limited and speech was dangerous, rhythm and rhyme ensured memory and survival. Psychologically, these rhymes also helped communities process trauma. Turning fear into song allowed people to regain a sense of control over events they could not change. The repetition soothed anxiety, while the symbolism preserved meaning. Thus, nursery rhymes are not trivial. They are evidence, oral records of how ordinary people experienced extraordinary suffering. To dismiss them as nonsense is to ignore one of humanity's most subtle methods of historical resistance. And this leads us to an even darker question. If these rhymes encoded real suffering, why are they still taught to children today, often without explanation? Plague, death, and disease hidden in children's songs. Few themes are as unsettling in nursery rhymes as the recurring presence of illness, sudden death, and mass suffering. While these elements are often overlooked or dismissed as coincidence, a closer, investigative analysis suggests that many classic rhymes may be deeply connected to historical epidemics, especially the bubonic plague, which devastated Europe repeatedly between the 14th and 17th centuries. During these centuries, disease was not an abstract concept. It was a daily reality. Entire families vanished within days, villages were abandoned, and fear spread faster than any infection. Yet, public discussion of plague was often suppressed or distorted by authorities, either to prevent panic or to protect economic and political interests. In this context, nursery rhymes may have served as a covert method of recording collective trauma. Perhaps the most frequently cited example is Ring Around the Rosie. On the surface, it appears to be a playful circle game. However, one widely known interpretation links its lyrics directly to plague symptoms and burial practices. The Rosie is often associated with the red rash that appeared on the skin of plague victims. Pocket full of posies may refer to the herbs people carried, believing they could ward off infection. The final line, "We all fall down," is chilling when viewed through a historical lens, suggesting sudden death. While some folklorists argue that this interpretation emerged later and lacks definitive proof, the rhyme's dark imagery remains undeniable. Its endurance suggests that even if it did not originate as a literal plague song, it resonated deeply with societies shaped by epidemic fear. Another example is Aitishu. Aitishu, the sneezing sound embedded in some versions of the rhyme. Sneezing was commonly associated with illness, and in plague-era Europe, it often signaled the beginning of a fatal infection. The casual way this symptom is incorporated into a children's song reflects how normalized disease had become in everyday life. From a journalistic standpoint, what is most striking is not whether each rhyme can be definitively traced to a specific outbreak, but how death is normalized through repetition and melody. Singing about falling down, disappearance, or sudden endings allowed communities to process loss collectively, especially in a time when grief counseling, psychological support, or even medical explanations were non-existent. There is also the rhyme, "There was an old woman who lived in a shoe," often interpreted as a humorous tale of chaos. Yet some historians see it as a metaphor for overcrowded urban housing during times of disease. Cities swelled beyond capacity, sanitation collapsed, and sickness spread rapidly. The many children, with nothing to do, may symbolize helpless populations trapped in conditions they could not escape. Importantly, these songs were not written for children in the modern sense. Childhood itself was viewed differently in medieval and early modern societies. Children were exposed early to death, labor, and suffering. Nursery rhymes, therefore, reflected the world as it was, not as adults wished it to be. Psychologically, encoding death into song served a protective function. Music and rhyme reduce fear, create predictability, and offer emotional distance. When death becomes part of a game or a chant, it feels less overwhelming. This coping mechanism may explain why such grim themes survived for centuries without being erased. However, the continued use of these rhymes in modern childhood raises ethical questions. Today, they are often taught stripped of context, presented as innocent traditions. Yet, when examined closely, they represent unresolved historical trauma, passed down unconsciously. This investigation does not claim that every nursery rhyme is a direct record of plague events. Instead, it reveals a broader truth. Children's songs often functioned as emotional archives, preserving how societies lived with constant mortality. Understanding this transforms the way we hear these melodies. What once sounded playful now echoes with grief, fear, and resilience. And as we move forward in this investigation, the question becomes even more disturbing. If disease and death were hidden in song, what other forms of violence were disguised as children's entertainment? Violence, punishment, and social control disguised as play. Beyond disease and death, many classic nursery rhymes contain explicit references to violence, punishment, and the rigid enforcement of social order. What is most disturbing is not simply the presence of cruelty, but how casually it is presented, often wrapped in cheerful rhythms that disguise its severity. From an investigative perspective, these rhymes may reveal how societies normalized violence and used storytelling as a tool of behavioral control. One of the clearest examples is Rock-a-Bye Baby. On the surface, it is a lullaby meant to soothe infants. Yet its lyrics describe a baby in a cradle falling from a treetop and crashing to the ground. There is no rescue, no lesson, no comfort, only an abrupt ending. For modern listeners, this seems alarming. Historically, however, high infant mortality was common, and sudden death was a tragic but familiar reality. Singing about it may have reflected emotional detachment developed as a survival mechanism. From a sociological angle, the rhyme also carries an implicit warning: instability leads to disaster. Some researchers interpret the treetop as a metaphor for power or status, suggesting that those placed too high, socially or politically, are vulnerable to sudden downfall. If so, the the rhyme subtly reinforces acceptance of hierarchy and the consequences of overreaching. Another striking example is Jack and Jill. Traditionally told as a simple tale of two children fetching water, the rhyme ends with Jack falling down and breaking his crown, followed by Jill tumbling after him. While often interpreted as slapstick humor, historians have proposed darker interpretations, including political allegory and even execution symbolism. The word crown may imply authority, and its breaking suggests punishment or loss of power. Whether or not such interpretations are historically accurate, what remains clear is that injury and suffering are treated as entertainment. Pain becomes rhythm. Trauma becomes routine. This pattern reflects a time when public punishments, corporal discipline, and harsh correction were normalized methods of maintaining order. Perhaps the most explicit example of punishment appears in This Little Piggy. The final line, "This little piggy went we all the way home," is often accompanied by squeezing or tickling a child's toe, turning distress into laughter. Some folklorists suggest that the crying pig represents hunger, loss, or exclusion, hinting at class disparity or famine. Once again, suffering is softened through play. Nursery rhymes also reinforced obedience. Many include consequences for misbehavior, even if implied rather than stated. Falling, breaking, disappearing, or being taken away all serve as warnings. In societies where direct explanation was rare and authority unquestioned, these rhymes helped shape behavior from an early age. From a psychological standpoint, repetition played a crucial role. When violent imagery is repeated in a predictable pattern, it becomes less shocking. Children learn what outcomes to expect and internalize rules without conscious reflection. This mirrors how cultural norms are transmitted across generations, not through instruction, but through immersion. Importantly, these rhymes were often shared orally by caregivers who themselves had internalized the same messages. There was no clear boundary between entertainment and indoctrination. Songs served as both comfort and conditioning. Modern audiences may dismiss these interpretations as overanalysis, yet the persistence of violent imagery across cultures suggests a deeper function. These rhymes survived not because they were harmless, but because they were effective, emotionally memorable, and socially useful. In an investigative context, this raises an uncomfortable question. Were nursery rhymes an early form of psychological training, preparing children to accept hardship, authority, and loss as inevitable parts of life? As we move to the next topic, the investigation shifts from physical violence to symbolic power. If these rhymes enforced order and punishment, we must ask, who benefited from these messages, and how were they encoded to avoid scrutiny? Political satire and hidden criticism of power. While violence and punishment shaped behavior at a personal level, many nursery rhymes also appear to operate on a broader political plane. Beneath their playful surfaces, some rhymes may function as covert social commentary, subtle critiques of rulers, institutions, and power structures at times when open dissent was dangerous or forbidden. From an investigative and journalistic perspective, this possibility transforms nursery rhymes from innocent folklore into tools of coded resistance. Historically, literacy rates were low, censorship was strict, and criticizing monarchs or religious authorities could lead to imprisonment or execution. In such environments, symbolism became a survival strategy. Songs, especially those associated with children, were unlikely to be scrutinized. This made them ideal vessels for hidden messages. One of the most discussed examples is Ba, Ba, Black Sheep. On its surface, it is a simple rhyme about wool distribution. However, many historians connect it to medieval taxation policies, particularly the heavy wool taxes imposed by the English crown in the 13th century. The 3 bags full are often interpreted as representing shares taken by the king, the church, and the landowner, leaving little for the producer. If this interpretation holds, the rhyme quietly exposes economic exploitation under feudal rule. Another politically charged rhyme is Humpty Dumpty. Widely portrayed as an egg, the original text never describes him as such. Instead, some scholars suggest Humpty Dumpty symbolized either a fallen monarch or a powerful military weapon, such as a cannon used during the English Civil War. His great fall and the inability of all the king's horses and all the king's men to restore him may reflect the collapse of authority and the limits of state power. What makes this particularly compelling is how failure is framed. The king's men are present, powerful, and numerous, yet useless. The rhyme subtly questions the effectiveness of centralized authority without explicitly naming it. London Bridge is falling down is another striking case. While often linked to structural decay, alternative interpretations associate the bridge's collapse with political instability, invasions, or internal collapse of governance. The repeated rebuilding and failure could symbolize cycles of leadership, reform, and decay, suggesting skepticism toward promises of lasting stability. From a journalistic standpoint, the brilliance of these rhymes lies in their ambiguity. They never accuse directly. Instead, they invite interpretation, allowing listeners to recognize injustice without overtly stating it. This ambiguity ensured their survival across centuries while protecting their creators. The question of intent remains debated. Were these rhymes deliberately political, or did political meanings accumulate over time? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Folklore evolves, absorbing new meanings as societies change. What begins as a simple song can become a vessel for collective memory and critique. Psychologically, these rhymes offered a sense of shared understanding. Singing them created subtle solidarity, a quiet acknowledgement that power was flawed, unstable, and often unjust. Even children, repeating these lines without comprehension, participated in the preservation of dissenting narratives. In modern times, the political edge of nursery rhymes has been largely neutralized. They are packaged as harmless traditions, their origins rarely discussed. Yet when stripped of melody and examined as text, their subversive potential reemerges. This realization forces us to reconsider how culture communicates truth under pressure. When speech is controlled, meaning does not disappear, it disguises itself. As this investigation continues, one final layer remains to be uncovered. If nursery rhymes conceal death, violence, and political critique, what do they reveal about the human need to process fear, power, and survival through storytelling itself? Myth, interpretation, and the limits of historical truth. As compelling as the hidden symbolism theories surrounding nursery rhymes may be, a responsible investigative approach must also confront skepticism, academic disagreement, and the limits of what can truly be proven. Not every dark interpretation is supported by solid historical evidence, and many scholars caution against projecting modern anxieties onto ancient verses. This tension between myth and documentation lies at the heart of the nursery rhyme debate. From a historical standpoint, one major challenge is the lack of written records. Most nursery rhymes were transmitted orally for generations before being written down. This makes it difficult to trace a single origin, author, or intended meaning. Verses often changed over time, absorbing local references, political shifts, and cultural fears. What may appear as deliberate symbolism today could, in some cases, be coincidence shaped by repetition. Folklorists argue that humans are pattern-seeking by nature. When faced with ambiguous material, we instinctively search for meaning, especially darker meaning. This psychological tendency can lead to overinterpretation, where ordinary imagery is retroactively linked to historical events without sufficient evidence. From this perspective, some plague-related interpretations, such as those attached to Ring Around the Rosie, may reflect 20th century fears rather than medieval intent. Yet dismissing all symbolic readings would also be intellectually dishonest. Cultural artifacts rarely survive centuries without resonance. The persistence of certain themes, falling, breaking, disappearing, punishment, collapse, suggests that these rhymes touch something fundamental in the human experience. Even if they were not consciously designed as coded messages, they may still reflect collective emotional truth rather than factual reporting. This distinction is crucial. Nursery rhymes may not function as literal historical documents, but as emotional records. They capture how people felt about power, death, and instability, even if they do not describe specific events. In this sense, symbolic interpretations can still hold value without claiming absolute historical accuracy. Academically, the debate reveals a broader conflict between disciplines. Historians demand verifiable sources, dates, and documentation. Cultural theorists, psychologists, and anthropologists, however, focus on meaning, memory, and narrative transmission. Nursery rhymes exist at the intersection of these fields, making them resistant to definitive conclusions. There is also the issue of romanticization. Modern audiences often find hidden meanings more fascinating than mundane explanations. A rhyme about a bridge collapsing becomes more intriguing when framed as political metaphor rather than poor construction. This tendency can distort analysis, prioritizing sensational interpretations over cautious scholarship. Journalistically, the responsibility lies in presenting possibilities without declaring certainty. The most honest conclusion is not that nursery rhymes definitively encode secret histories, but that they operate in a gray zone between reality, myth, and memory. They are layered texts shaped by time, fear, humor, and survival. Another overlooked factor is play itself. Children's games often include exaggerated danger, mock violence, and absurd outcomes. Falling, crashing, or dying in play may not always signify trauma. It can also reflect experimentation with fear in a safe environment. Not every dark element must be rooted in historical catastrophe. Still, even skeptics acknowledge that nursery rhymes reflect the harshness of the eras in which they circulated. High mortality, rigid authority, and public punishment were normalized realities. Whether symbolic or literal, these conditions inevitably influenced storytelling. Ultimately, the debate over meaning may be less important than the questions these rhymes provoke. Why do we sanitize them today? Why are their origins rarely discussed? And why does uncovering potential darkness beneath childhood innocence feel so unsettling? These questions suggest that nursery rhymes function as mirrors, revealing not only the past, but how modern society chooses to remember or forget it. As we approach the final topic, the investigation turns toward the present. If these rhymes still circulate today, unchanged and unexplained, what role do they play in the modern world, and why do they continue to matter? Why these rhymes still matter in the modern world? In an age dominated by digital media, rapid information flow, and constant reinterpretation of history, it may seem strange that centuries-old nursery rhymes still survive almost unchanged. Yet their persistence raises a critical investigative question. Why do these simple verses continue to matter, and what function do they serve today? From a cultural perspective, nursery rhymes are among the earliest narratives we encounter. Long before formal education, they introduce rhythm, language patterns, and shared references. Because they are learned so early, they become deeply embedded in memory, often escaping conscious scrutiny. This makes them uniquely powerful carriers of cultural values, assumptions, and emotional frameworks. Modern society tends to frame childhood as a protected space, separate from violence, politics, and death. However, the rhymes we continue to pass down often contradict this ideal. Falling, breaking, disappearance, punishment, and collective collapse remain central motifs. Even when stripped of historical context, these themes subtly shape how children understand risk, authority, and consequence. Psychologists suggest that early exposure to symbolic danger through play and song may serve a developmental purpose. It allows children to explore fear in a controlled environment, building emotional resilience. In this sense, nursery rhymes function as safe simulations of chaos, preparing young minds to navigate uncertainty. The problem arises when these symbols remain unexplained, leaving meaning to be absorbed unconsciously. From a media studies standpoint, nursery rhymes can be seen as one of the earliest forms of viral content. They spread orally, adapt easily, and resist deletion. Their survival mirrors modern memes, simple, repeatable, and emotionally charged. Like memes, they often carry subtext that is invisible at first glance. In the modern world, where misinformation and hidden messaging are constant concerns, revisiting nursery rhymes offers an unexpected lesson. They demonstrate how meaning can persist without clarity, how narratives shape belief, and how repetition normalizes ideas. Understanding this helps sharpen media literacy, especially in recognizing symbolic framing in contemporary content. There is also a broader ethical question. Should we continue teaching these rhymes without context? Some educators argue for preserving tradition, while others advocate reinterpretation or explanation. The debate reflects a larger struggle over how societies handle uncomfortable history, whether to confront it openly or disguise it as harmless tradition. Importantly, uncovering potential darkness in nursery rhymes does not require their rejection. Instead, it invites conscious engagement. When adults understand where these verses may have come from, they can choose how to present them, either as historical artifacts, cultural metaphors, or starting points for discussion. Journalistically, this investigation highlights how innocence and truth are not opposites. Stories meant for children often carry the weight of adult experience. Recognizing this does not corrupt childhood, it honors the complexity of human storytelling. In a world still marked by disease, political instability, and social inequality, these rhymes remain strangely relevant. They remind us that fear, humor, and resistance have always coexisted, and that even the simplest songs can carry centuries of meaning. Ultimately, nursery rhymes endure because they speak in symbols rather than facts. They survive not by explaining the world, but by echoing it. And perhaps that is their greatest power, quietly teaching us that beneath every familiar melody, there may be a story we have yet to question.